So we have to go deeper and say this isn't just an entertainment industry problem, this is a capitalism problem. And so once we recognize this as a capitalism problem, we can, as arts workers, go further and say, how do we use our power, especially those of us who are on strike right now? How do we use our power to start hitting blows at the capitalist system itself?
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Right now, 2 unions are on strike and have ground the entertainment industry to a halt. The Writers Guild of America, the WGA, and the Screen Actors Guild, or SAG-AFTRA. The WGA began its strike in May and was joined in July by SAG-AFTRA, and it's the first time since the 1960s that both of these unions have gone on strike at the same time. So, why have the WGA and SAG-AFTRA, around 170,000 workers in total, decided to strike? One reason is that although these workers do the labor in the entertainment industry, actually writing and acting in movies and TV shows, etc., they make crumbs compared to the executives. Obviously, A-list actors like Tom Cruise, Scarlett Johansson, they make millions of dollars as actors. But actually less than 13% of SAG members make enough to qualify for union healthcare. This means they make less than $27,000 a year. Compare this to the average pay of the Hollywood executives, people like Warner Brothers CEO David Zaslav, Netflix's Reed Hastings, Apple's Tim Cook, who get compensation in the tens of millions of dollars every year. In other words, just like in other industries, the profits in Hollywood are going to the bosses at the top and not to the workers actually doing the labor. A big part of the context here that we'll discuss today is streaming. The rise of, for example, Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, and Disney+. Compared to the days of yore, so the days of movie theater tickets and commercials on TV shows, streaming is just much, much, much less profitable for companies. And these losses are being passed on to the entertainment industry workers, like the writers and actors who are currently on strike, but also certainly other workers in the industry who, just like these writers and actors, are increasingly being squeezed by these companies. Their pay and working conditions are declining. Another issue at play is the fight over the use of artificial intelligence. Studios are hoping to cut costs by using advances in AI to, for example, help write scripts. So, for example, artificial intelligence could perhaps generate like a draft of a script, and then the studios could pay a writer much less to then like edit that script, for example. And when it comes to actors, AI is very contentious because it could be used to, for example, create like digital copies of actors for background scenes and things like that. To talk about these entertainment industry strikes and what's at stake, I am joined once again by our frequent guest, my Left Voice comrade, Enid Brain. Enid has written an excellent article about these strikes, which I will link to in the show notes. Enid and I also discuss the key lessons that this struggle holds for the labor movement, what the tasks are for the left, and why entertainment workers need to go beyond just fighting for a better contract in the here and now. As Enid explains, this is not a problem unique to the entertainment industry. The system of creating art and of creating entertainment is extremely broken, extremely exploitative, and we need to organize to bring this system, this capitalist system, down. As always, we are a volunteer-run podcast and publication, so if you can, we'd appreciate your support at patreon.com/leftvoice. Please also leave us a nice review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. We're on social media where you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @left_voice. We have the same handle on TikTok And we are freshly on Blue Sky under the handle leftvoice, all one word, .bsky.social. If you would like to follow Enid on Twitter, you can do so at the handle at Enid Brain. Here is my interview with Enid. Enid, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I want to start as usual by setting the stage a little bit. Because on the one hand, obviously, the timing of the strikes we're talking about today are related to the end of their current contracts. But we also need to look at the sort of broader context of why these workers are striking, what's been going on to squeeze them so much, like make them more precarious, and why their working conditions generally have been worsening. So, the first thing I wanted to ask you is if you could talk a little bit about the overall crisis going on in the entertainment industry.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think, as you were saying, this strike is complicated on one hand because it's about some very like concrete bread and butter issues, but on the other hand because it's about essentially attempting to reverse this generalized trend within the entertainment industry, and a trend that has left the bosses of the entertainment industry with a lot less space to give concessions to the workers. And that's because there's what I theorize in an article that I wrote for the website as a crisis of accumulation in Hollywood, which is essentially, as all capitalist businesses are, they're based around getting as much surplus value out of workers as possible. And then you must always have growth. Each year you have to grow more or you're considered to be, falling behind in crisis, etc., from a capitalist economic perspective. And a combination of COVID and the rise of streaming, and obviously those two things are very connected, right? The rise of streaming was only intensified by COVID and some relatively poor strategic decisions made by the entertainment companies within that. But the shift to streaming has essentially caused this crisis of accumulation in Hollywood because now you have, where the way things used to be, right? Not even, 15, 20 years ago, is if you wanted to see a movie, you had to go and pay $10 or whatever for a movie ticket. And however many people bought tickets for that, that's how much the profits were. And those were split amongst the cinemas, and then the rest of it went to the entertainment company with a small pittance paid to the artists involved, a thing called residuals. We're going to be talking about residuals a lot because that's a key demand of the strike. But that's basically how film was profitized, right? Is that it's the people who went and bought tickets for the movie theater. And then once home video, DVDs, VHSs, and things like that, that was just like an extra, sort of little money to put on top. But the main money always came from the theatrical run, and that's how you see, these crazy numbers like the Avengers movie that made billions and billions and billions of dollars, around the world. You saw this recently with Avatar, etc. Right? And then for TV, the system was, you made a TV show, you put it on television, and then you sold ads, you sold commercials, and the more popular the show, the more expensive the commercial you could have. And that's how all this stuff was profitized. That's how all this stuff made money. But with the rise of the internet and the rise of streaming, so much of this has shifted. And so now everything is becoming a much more subscription-based model. And there are a whole variety of issues with this from a capitalist point of view. The first being it's much harder to figure out how much money any individual thing made. The second problem is it's much harder to actually make any money off of anything, because if you think about it, a Netflix, a monthly Netflix account is something like $13, $14, right? Something like that. That's the cost of 1.5 movie tickets. And so when you're putting new movies onto, be that HBO, be that Netflix, be that Hulu, or what have you, Disney Plus, then that means that if you watch 2 movies, you've saved money, right? And so and especially like when you think about family entertainment films, so many of the Pixar films are being put straight on Disney Plus, you save money. And even in the situations where these things are being put up for paid or what's called premium video on demand, which is where you have to pay sort of extra. This was a new sort of COVID thing. What if we just took the movies from the theaters and just put them up for a high streaming rate? Those are still, clocking in at something like between $20 and $30 for a rental, which is a lot of money for a rental for the consumer. But if you think about it, 5 movie tickets to watch for the family of 5 is going to be way more than that. And so we're seeing this crisis of accumulation because they just can't make as much money as they needed to. And so because obviously the way this is going to be responded is by trying to pass on the cost to the consumers and to the workers. This has resulted in a squeeze throughout the entertainment industry where the rise of what's called micro rooms for writers, where fewer writers are being hired, where production is being shipped more and more overseas, right? Where they're just like a lot of Netflix shows are just being bought from international distributors and put on the channel that way. And then also, this sort of crisis of do we start adding ads back into streaming? And so we've seen this with Hulu, we're seeing this with Disney, we're seeing this with Paramount Plus, we're seeing this with Peacock, and we're seeing this with Netflix as well. Is they're having to add ads back, but still you're not able to have as much ads because it used to be every show you had 4 or 5 ads in it, right? An hour-long television show is 45 minutes long because 15 minutes of that is ad space, and that's all money that you can make. And so all of this is to say, in a very long-winded way, is that there's this issue where the capitalists just can't make enough money. And so they're having to try and push that on by finding ways to squeeze wherever possible. And that's created both a situation where fewer people are being hired and they're being paid less. And then they're not getting residuals, right? Which is supposed to be a percentage of the profit that is paid to the creatives. And because of this shift to streaming, it's much harder to sort of calculate how much money you are actually owed by your employer. And so if a show is a hit on Netflix, how much money did that generate? How do you actually calculate that? And also the question is, are any of these companies actually profitable? Are there actually any profits to get? And obviously, these companies don't want to release any of these numbers, both because they don't want their workers to know, but also because the theory goes most of these entertainment companies are operating at a very, very low economic level, which, if this became clear, would completely cause a crisis of the film and television industry in terms of like the stock prices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're in this moment where the workers are striking for more to reverse some of these trends, right? To fight against these micro rooms, to fight for more residuals, to fight against the use of AI, which there's this hope from the capitalists to use AI to cut costs even more, right? To replace background actors or extras, as they're more commonly called, which is the majority of the union, with AI sort of digital recreations of actors that you can just plot wherever. So all of these are cost saving tactics as a way of trying to reverse this crisis of accumulation. And so the strike is saying, no, you're not going to make us pay for that. But there is a really open question about how much space there actually is to give concession to these artists and to these workers.
Yeah, to the point about how much these companies are making and how they deliberately make things very opaque, something that's also interesting is that whereas we do have a sense of like how much movies make in the box office, like I guess Barbie just crossed like the $1
Yeah,
billion mark, we don't actually know how many times things are watched on these streaming platforms. Like that's also in addition to being very opaque about like the money and things like that. They also we like don't really know how many people, for example, watched White Lotus or how many people watched like Netflix shows and things like that.
absolutely, right. And so you're not, and because of that, you as an artist going into negotiation aren't able to actually know your worth and negotiate from that perspective. And so this has been used to keep the workers in the dark as a way of trying to pay them less and less and less. But I think it's also important to note this is like not a new phenomenon, right? The specific complexities of streaming obviously add to it, but there's this phrase in the entertainment industry of Hollywood accounting, and Hollywood accounting is used for years to essentially claim that movies didn't make any money. Right, the screenwriter of Men in Black famously claimed to him that that movie lost money, and so they never had to pay him residuals. Right, Peter Jackson had to sue for some of his money as part of Lord of the Rings. Right, and obviously we think about Men in Black, we think about Lord of the Rings. These are incredibly popular, incredibly valuable properties. And so there's always this idea of attempting to nickel and dime the workers of Hollywood, as is every capitalist industry. But it's become much more complex now because there's just simply less money to go around, given the ways that streaming has impacted the industry, in addition to the way COVID shrunk the industry, right? And COVID has created all sorts of complicated considerations for the entertainment industry, beginning with the fact that they weren't able to produce, with the fact that movie theaters were closed, which then pushed the streaming thing more and more and more, which then created in consumers this idea of why would I go to the movie theater when I can just watch it at home? And obviously, Barbie and Oppenheimer are sort of counter examples of that. But we're still seeing the movie studios operate under this logic of we need to get things on premium VOD as quickly as possible.
So far, we've been talking about the WGA and SAG-AFTRA, but there is a third related union that notably is not on strike, which is the DGA, Directors Guild of America. And that union recently renewed its contract with the AMPTP, so they are not part of this strike right now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a contradictory situation that I don't know enough about to make any sort of sweeping comments. I will say that there was a pretty strong vote no campaign, and a lot of quite well known directors were all over social media being like, we have to vote no, this isn't good enough. And not only is this not good enough, this is selling out our comrades in WGA. And so as to why they didn't, I don't quite know. I don't know the nuances of the DGA. I know that they agreed to negotiate in private as compared to the WGA, which refused that initially, though I think they've gone back on that now. But yeah, the DGA was sort of split off from the coalition, which prevented a full Hollywood general strike, which would have been really really impactful. And we also need to think about like IATSE and the Teamsters, whose contracts should be coming up soon, who are also Hollywood workers who also could go out on strike. And probably by that point, the strike will be resolved. But it seems that the labor issues in Hollywood aren't going anywhere. And so we need to start to think really critically as people who think about the labor movement, people who think about the left, people who think about the fight against capitalism, about what's going on in the entertainment industry and how we can build on that to build something better for the whole labor movement.
I think it's interesting what you were saying about nickel and diming and residuals and things like that, because apparently this is pretty similar to what happened back in the 1960s that actually created the residual model. So back in the 1960s, which correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that was the last time writers and actors went
We're on
on
strike
strike at the same
together.
time. Funnily enough, the actors were led by Ronald Reagan, famed workers' rights advocate. No, just kidding.
Can I say one quick thing about that?
Please do, yes.
So people bring this up all the time that Ronald Reagan was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, which is true, obviously, and he did lead the strike in the 60s. But very few people bring up the fact that one of Ronald Reagan's primary political tasks as the president of SAG was to get the communists out. And so he became president of SAG to help with the McCarthy era Red Scare that drove so many creatives into exile from the industry. So just there's always especially now there's a lot of weird, it was Ronald Reagan. It's yeah, but what else was Ronald Reagan doing as president of the Actors Union, right? And I think that helps reveal some things about the union bureaucracy. And we don't have to get into Fran Drescher, but I think we can ask some similar questions about Fran Drescher and her tenure as president of the Screen Actors Guild, despite the beautiful speeches she's been making recently.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, also thinking about how there are certain people in Hollywood who had, anti-communist past as well and things like that, I think is good to keep in mind instead of not to say, we really have to give it to Ronald Reagan because we certainly don't. But so that was what, from my understanding, the residual model that we have now was because apparently the rise of TV and, movies getting rerun on TV after being in the theaters was criticized for not giving actors, what they made when movies were released at the box office and things like that. And then that created the model that we kind of live under right now. So I know obviously we don't have a crystal ball here to really see exactly what kinds of concessions these workers are going to get, but do you see there being some sort of transformation akin to what we experienced in the 1960s with residuals back then? Or what are the kinds of concessions that you think will be won by these workers?
It seems likely that they're going to win some concessions, right? And I think specifically around AI, I suspect that these strikes will stop the spread of AI, at least to some extent. And so I don't want to sort of underplay the potential wins that they could get. I guess my point is that I think that the reason it's gotten to this point is that there's just way less space to for the entertainment bosses to move and manipulate in order to get this gone, because they need to maintain their profit margins. But something else that I think is important is that, and I talk about this in the article, is that if we look at the last WGA strike, which was when the mid to late 2000s, a lot of the strikes, a lot of the demands of the writer strike also had to do with residuals, also had to do with online shows and things like that. And so we're in this situation where we're kind of fighting the same fight again, though with new stand-ins for the evils of of capitalism in entertainment. And so really, as we think about like how to move forward and like what lessons to draw from the strike, the hamster wheel of fighting contract to contract to contract, I think, is a really important one. Is that we can see that like, they'll make a deal that we're supposed to get them more residuals, is supposed to prevent the ways that they are able to, cut workers, automate things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then some new technology will come along, or they'll find a loophole or what have you, and then we'll be right back in this situation again, because it's a systemic problem. It's a systemic problem, and it seems that there aren't a lot of transitionatory measures that can be done to really fix these problems of the entertainment industry in the United States, outside of radically rethinking the way we work them. And something else that I think is important to add is that over the past period, we've seen the sort of growth of like monopolization capital, right? And so a lot of these entertainment companies, which used to be owned by people who wanted to own entertainment companies, which means that they had a specific understanding of that industry and what sort of profit margins were reasonable to expect from that industry, have now been replaced by these giant telecommunications companies, and these, the AT&T is owning these companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so then they're being run like these sort of companies, which means increasing profits, increasing profits, increasing profits, which has stretched the entertainment industry past the sort of profit margins that it's always been able to sort of hold. You know what I mean? And so, again, unless like as long as these people are making the decisions, they're always going to be trying to find a way to screw over workers and pass down the costs to both workers and the consumers. And so as we think about how to like resist the structural problem of Hollywood, these strikes are a great example of how to fight that. And as we think about how to resolve that, we have to think about having much broader demands and a much broader perspective on how to resolve the entertainment industry. And we've had this entire conversation without even talking about the fact, like, even touching upon the fact that this is a dreadful way to actually produce art and entertainment, right? Like, this is not a good way of producing culture. And so we're in this moment where we have all of these different forces at play, and a lot of these like giant capitalist companies. Like, one of the companies being struck against right now is Amazon, right? Amazon is a key employer in the entertainment industry because of Amazon Prime Video, etc. Right? We're talking about strikes against Apple. And so like these are strikes against these major corporations that touch on all these other larger structural problems that we're seeing in our society.
Yeah, speaking of sort of this broader perspective of problems in society, the economics around here, I want to ask a little bit about sort of the more general topic of organizing the arts. I remember actually this joke that you made to me like a few years ago, right when we met. I think at the time you had a theater job, and you said something like, ah, yes, theater workers, the most strategic sector of the working class. And I just thought that was like the funniest thing, basically. And, it's true in a certain sense that like arts workers aren't like quote unquote strategic in the way that like, for example, logistics workers or like UPS workers are. But why is it still important to organize in the arts? And like, what would your response be, for example, to people who say that like, actually, focusing on arts organizing is like frivolous. We actually need to put all our efforts into organizing, logistics workers, oil and energy workers. What is your response to that? And why is it so important that we cover this strike and the struggle?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so I think it's twofold, right? On the one hand, absolutely, arts workers are not the most strategic sector of the working class, but also if we think about what arts workers make one of the biggest United States exports around the world, which is the film and television industry, right? Which then, from a Gramscian perspective of the integral state and things like that, means that they do a lot of ideological reproduction for the state, which means that like it's a really key recruiting tool. It's a really key ideological hegemony tool for the bourgeois order, is the work that entertainment workers produce for um, these giant corporations, which is not to say that the workers themselves are responsible for the ideological reproduction, but that's what a lot of film and television does, right? And it's a huge, huge export. And it's especially interesting as we think about, and we keep talking about the larger US competition with China, that competition with China is a key consideration in a lot of film and television decisions of, is this going to play in China? Are we going to be able to take that like capture that Chinese market? And so that's a key decision. And the other thing that I would add is that like it's also responsible for huge amounts of tourism and huge amounts of industry. So like I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a large percentage of New York and LA's industry is arts workers, right? And and then add to that the amount of money generated by tourism. And why do tourists go to Hollywood? Tourists go to Hollywood because they want to see where the movies are made, right? And so all of these things are things that like cities and states rely upon. And there was something like the last WGA strike cost the state of California billions of dollars. And that cost them billions of dollars because the film and television is a major, major industry in California. And so as we think about these workers, they do connect to and they do control through their labor a huge sector of the U.S. economy. And then adding to that, that these workers are increasingly sort of in solidarity, whether they realize it or not, with other workers at these same companies, right? Not that the writers on Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, have a lot in common in terms of their day to day working conditions with the Amazon warehouse workers, but they're both fighting the same guys. You know what I mean? The Amazon labor union is trying to fight against Amazon, doing speed ups and depriving them of the money that they're owed. That's what the Amazon writers are fighting against too, right? And so going beyond just the sort of aesthetic differences and seeing that like, we always say that like, oh, same struggle, same fight, we're all fighting the same capitalist system, which is true, of course, but in this situation they're actually fighting the same people. And so to see that solidarity and to see the ways that solidarity has potential is can be really, I think, powerful and key at developing a labor movement that can fight. And I think that's what one of the things the strike has shown us the most is the power of solidarity. The fact that SAG and WGA went out together, the fact that the Hollywood Teamsters did a variety of events with them, the fact that there are international unions that are like doing events in solidarity with the strike, the fact that the theatrical unions are doing solidarity pickets with this strike are all signs of how powerful this solidarity can be. And if we can build the solidarity beyond just this sector of industry and really start to say, like, we need to be standing with all these other labor unions that are fighting for the same things we're fighting for, just in different names sometimes. Then we can start to see how really this sort of solidarity and this strike can be a huge example for the labor movement and how to make itself into a really fighting power. Like imagine how powerful it would be if the Amazon writers in the WGA and SAG went and did a picket at an Amazon factory, right? Like imagine how powerful that would be. And imagine if they started doing events and helping with the people trying to organize Amazon across the country, right?
Totally, yeah, that's a really, really powerful point about like uniting our struggles. And I think a lot of people like instinctively they don't really think about the fact that, like you're saying these days, some of these biggest companies are, for example, Amazon and Apple, which are companies that also are having a lot of like organizing efforts, labor disputes, and things like that among warehouse workers, factory workers, and people like that.
Absolutely.
To the point also of connecting the strike to other struggles, I wanted to pivot a little bit to something else that's very notable in the United States in particular right now, which is that we're living in a moment of really unprecedented attacks on oppressed people. So, something that you especially have written about is these attacks on LGBTQ people, on trans people. We've also written a lot about the attacks on reproductive rights and curtailing the right to an abortion in a lot of states. I wanted to ask a bit about the ways that the strikes could take up these struggles and ways that you feel like the WGA or SAG have talked about fighting for these struggles.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think other than the solidarity, this is one of the most inspiring things to me about the Hollywood strikes is that they're doing, pride themed pickets. They're doing abortion themed pickets. They did an abortion picket in New York where they brought, various sectors of the, usually the abortion NGO sort of class, but, people who think about and organize about abortion to make speeches to the picket line about why abortion is a labor rights issue. And the actress Zoe Kazan spoke about needing reproductive health care while she was on a job, and also talked about how, as an actor, you have to go to all sorts of places. You have to go to all sorts of places to film, right? One of the main filming locations in the United States right now is Atlanta, Georgia, right? As Georgia passes more and more reactionary laws against bodily autonomy, that affects the people who live in Georgia, obviously, but also any worker who is sent to Georgia as part of their job, right? And like, so in that sense, these are national attacks because workers have to, transport themselves across state borders and things like that. And so there's this idea of like, oh, well, that's just what the reactionary states are going to do. We're safe in our little liberal enclaves, which is problematic for a whole variety of reasons, such as the fact it completely ignores the working class and oppressed who live in those states. But also, even people who do not live there may have to go there for work. And I think, and the fact that that is being drawn out on the picket line shows that there is, an understanding by these workers and and a burgeoning understanding that the labor movement has to stand with this, and that we have to just go beyond just asking for, travel protections and things like that in the contract, which is one of the demands. And the speakers at the abortion picket said that they said we need to go beyond just having travel waivers, because what if you can't? What if you don't have time to travel? What if you need it urgently and you just can't get it? And so as we think about how to like build a movement to defeat these anti-bodily autonomy laws, the labor movement's going to be a key part of that. And I think SAG and WGA is one of the clearest examples of the labor movement sort of waking up and realizing that it's connected to all these things. And they've done, blackout pickets, they've done trans pickets, pride pickets, all these things. And so we can see that the WGA and SAG are at least rhetorically showing that they understand that the way these things intersect, and the way that they, as workers and as unionists, have a power and a responsibility to sort of take that fight up and stand with the people who are being attacked, because those people being attacked are also workers who are in these unions.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I think we've seen really incredible solidarity and people speaking out from other types of unions as well. Like I remember, I think it was the Jezebel Union or whatever larger media umbrella they're part of were fighting for trans healthcare and their contracts and things like that. And so I think that that's really important to bring up, is that unions are not just about these kind of bread and butter issues, which are really important here, obviously, like you've outlined, but like there's also the power to, for example, fight for rights for the oppressed.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely.
I wanted to come back to something you said a little bit earlier about being on this sort of hamster wheel of just fighting from contract to contract.
Mm-hmm.
So, we can see how, there's likely to be, perhaps in the coming months or by the end of the year, a resolution to the strike, and there might be a contract that is an improvement, that, maybe you see better residuals deals and things like that. There might be some concessions. But something you were saying earlier was that this is not really enough in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of like a big question here, but I'm wondering what you see is the alternative here. What are the tasks for the WGA and SAG-AFTRA, as well as for the left? Like those of us, like me, for example, I'm in neither of these unions. What are things that we have to do when it comes to arts organizing, and what are the ways that we can go beyond just fighting for this one better contract for these workers?
So we need to understand that these are systemic issues and issues of the way that these industries work. And so once we understand that these are systemic issues and issues of the way that these industries work, we can look deeper and say, no, these are issues of the way capitalism works, right? And like, I've said a lot about the ways that capitalism destroys, the economic foundation of a lot of workers. But also we have to think about like the way, for arts workers, so many of us are doing this because we're passionate about it, right? You can't just go and make the art you want to make, because you have all these capitalists in suits in boardrooms who are going to tell you what is going to play in Poughkeepsie, right? And what's going to make sure that they make the most money. And so situations like, the fact that like one of the movies that is being hailed as the movie of the year and as being such a specific like artistic vision is Greta Gerwig's Barbie is kind of depressing, right? Of that, like in order to get a movie made on that budget level and on that scale, Greta Gerwig had to go and make a film with Mattel, which then required her to pull all sorts of punches within that film. And I quite like Barbie, but all sorts of punches are being pulled around the way that Mattel interacts with womanhood and femininity, right? And so like we can see that like these things are not going to go away just depending on what contract it is. Artists are still going to be limited. You're still going to be, all of the things you make are still going to be made to make other people more money than you will ever get, right? We're talking about, David Zaslav, who runs Warner Brothers, makes something like 15 to $20 million a year, right? Maybe even more. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but he makes millions and millions of dollars a year, while the average writer makes like 16,000. So the average actor makes like 16,000. Right, and so this is the situation, and there's no contract that's going to be able to change the situation because this is foundational to the way this works. So we have to go deeper and say this isn't just an entertainment industry problem; this is a capitalism problem. And so once we recognize this as a capitalism problem, we can, as arts workers, go further and say, how do we use our power, especially those of us who are on strike right now? How do we use our power to start hitting blows at the capitalist system itself? And every time I'm on All That's Left, I'm banging the table about how we need something new, and so I'm going to bang the table again. Because if we think about like how do we keep this fight going, and the incredible solidarity that SAG and WGA are showing is solidarity that is vital to actually making sure that we can make something progressive come out of this. And the fact that the Teamsters are standing with them, the fact that a sector of the DGA tried to vote down their contract in order to stand with them, all of these things are signs of the nucleus of what we can build, which is a unity between workers and the oppressed in our own organization that fights that fights this system itself and fights for a better one, and fights for a system under which we don't have to go on strike to get anything we need, where we don't have to go on strike to get a couple pennies extra in residuals. We don't have to go on strike to say, hey, you can't pay us $100, scan our likeness and use it forever. Like that's one of the proposals of the AMTP, and that's ridiculous, right? That's a ridiculous way of putting huge swaths of actors on unemployment, right? And we don't have to, I was talking about a friend the other day who's a theater actor, and I was talking about how the sort of cycle of theater actors is, and film actors as well, is you have your job. Whenever the job ends, you go on unemployment until you either find a new one, or then you just like find a job at a restaurant or whatever, and that's how you pay your bills. And these are, at times very successful, very talented actors. And so this idea of the starving artist is one that is used to keep our wages low and keep our situations precarious, and we're told that we have to accept this because we love it. And these are all things that we can no longer accept, and that the logic of the SAG and WGA strike is we shouldn't accept this any longer. So we shouldn't accept it any longer. And if we're going to not accept it any longer, then we have to cut out the material basis for this exploitation. And also, if we're going to try and fight these oppressive laws, we're going to have to try and figure out where they're coming from. And I've talked a lot about this in a lot of places as to where these laws are coming from. But at the end of the day, they come from this same capitalist system that's trying to limit our bodily autonomy, that's trying to exploit us, that's trying to oppress us, all so that they can make more money off of us. And the logic of SAG and WGA is, no, you can't do that anymore. So let's actually make it so that they can't do it anymore. And then to do that, we need our own fighting power. And I quote this all the time, but Malcolm X said, we're not outnumbered, we're out organized. So let's get organized. And to get organized, we need to have a space, a political party where we could be with each other and not with our enemies. And so that means that we need a party that is of the working class, that's of the oppressed, and that's fighting against this capitalist system, and not just fighting against it, but fighting for something, and fighting for a better world, a world where we can make our art, a world where we don't have to worry about whether or not we can make art that is commercial enough, right? A world where we don't have to worry about where our next job is coming from. We can build that. Right? We can build that world if we overthrow this goddamn capitalist system. But we're going to have to do it with organization. And so I really think that the strong lesson for me of the strike is the solidarity that SAG and WGA are showing to each other, and that other unions are showing to these workers, is the same logic that we need to start to build our working class party that fights for socialism with.
Enid, thanks so much for being on the podcast, and I look forward to reading a bit more about how this struggle develops.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.